Chapter 22. It's a Zeppelin, Alex shouted. They found us. The wall count looked up. An airship, certainly, but that doesn't sound like a Zeppelin. Alec frowned, listening hard. Other noises, tremulous and nonsensical, trickled over the distant hum of engines. Squawks, whistles, and squeaks, like a menagerie let loose. The airship lacked the symmetry of a Zeppelin. The front end was larger than the stern, the surface molted and uneven. Clouds of tiny winged forms fluttered around it, and an unearthly green glow clung to its skin. Then Alex saw the huge eyes. God's wounds, he swore. This wasn't a machine at all, but a Doranus creation. He'd seen monsters before, of course, talking lizards in the fashionable parlors of Pergu, a draft animal displayed in a traveling circus, but nothing as gigantic as this. It was like one of his war toys come to life, 1,000 times larger and more incredible. What are Darwinists doing here? He said softly. Volger pointed, running from danger, it would seem. Alec's eyes followed the gesture, and he saw the ragged trails of bullet holes down the creature's flank, flickering with green light. Men swarmed in the rigging that hung from its sides, some wounded, some making repairs, and alongside them climbing things that weren't men. As the airship passed almost overhead, Alec half ducked behind the parapet, but the crew seemed too busy to notice anything. The ship slowly as it settled into the valley, dropping below the level of mountains on either side. Is that godless thing coming down? Alec asked. They seemed to have no choice. The vast creature glided away toward the white expanse of glacier, the only place in sight large enough for it to land. Even wounded, it fell as slowly as a feather. Alec held his breath for the long seconds that it remained posed above the snow. The crash unfolded slowly. White clouds rose up in the skidding airship's wake, its skin wiggling like a flag in the wind. Alex saw men thrown from their perches on its back, but it was too far away for their cries to reach him, even through the cold, clear air. Road of white. The highest mountains in Europe, and the war reaches us so quickly. Count Volger shook his head. What an age we live in. Do you think they saw us? In all that chaos? I'd think not. And this ruin won't look like much from a distance. Even when the sun comes up, the wild count sighed, but no cooking fires for a while. And we'll have to set a watch until they leave. What if they don't leave? Alex said. What if they can't? Then they won't last long, Volger said flatly. There's nothing to eat on the glacier. No shelter, no fuel for a fire, just ice. Alec turned to stare at Volger. But we can't leave shipwrecked men to die. May I remind you that they're the enemy, Alec? Just because the Germans are hunting us down doesn't make the Darwinists our friends. There could be 100 men aboard the ship, perhaps enough to take this castle. Volger's voice softened as he peered into the sky. Let's just hope no rescue comes for them. Aircraft overhead in daylight would be a disaster. Alec looked out across the glacier again. The snow thrown up by the crash was settling around the airship, revealing that it lay half on its side like a beached fish. He wondered if Darwinist creations died from the cold as quickly as natural beasts or men. 100 of them out there. He looked down at the stables below, food enough for a small army, and medicine for the wounded, and furs and firewood to keep them warm. We can't sit here and watch them die, Count. Enemies or not. Haven't you been listening? Volger cried. You're heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. Your duty is to the empire, not those men out there. Alec shook his head. At the moment, there isn't much I can do for the empire. Not yet. But if you keep yourself alive, soon enough you'll gain the power to stop this madness. Don't forget, the empire is 83 and war is unkind. The emperor is 83 and war is unkind to the old men. With those last words, Volger's voice broke, and suddenly he looked ancient himself, as if the last 5 weeks had finally caught up with him. Alex swallowed his answer, remembering that what Volger had sacrificed: his home, his rank, to be hunted and hounded, to go sleepless listening to wireless chatter. And with safety finally at hand, this obscene creature had fallen from the sky, threatening to wreck years of planning. No wonder he wanted to ignore the air beast dying on the snows a few kilometers away. Of course, Volger. Alec took his arm and led him down from the cold and windy parapet. We'll watch and wait. They'll probably repair the godless beast, Volger said on the stairs, and leave us behind without a second glance. No doubt. Halfway across the courtyard, Volger brought Alec to a sudden halt, his expression pained. We'd help him if we could, but this war could leave the whole continent in ruins. You see that, don't you? Alec nodded and led the Count into the great hall of the castle, where Bauer had piled wood into the fireplace. Seeing the food laid out and ready to cook, Volger let out a tired sigh and told the other man about the crashed ship. Another week without fires and long, cold watches every night. But eating in a castle, even a cold one, was still a pleasure after all those meals huddled in the Stormwalker's iron belly. The storerooms held luxuries that none of them had enjoyed. 4 weeks, smoked fish for dinner, dried fruit and canned peaches for dessert. The wine was excellent, and when Alec offered to take the first watch, the others drank to him deeply. No one talked about rescuing the airmen. Perhaps the other three assumed that the monstrous creature would fly away again. They hadn't seen the bullet holes in its flanks, or the men hanging wounded and lifeless in the rigging. Instantly, they talked like soldiers, discussing how to defend the castle against the aerial attacks. Bauer and Klopp argued about whether the Stormwalker's cannon could elevate high enough to hit the airship. Alec listened and watched. He'd slept most of the day, taking the controls only after sunset, when Klopp's old eyes always gave out. It was barely midnight now, and it would be dawn before he needed sleep. But the others were worn down by the day's journey and the freezing cold. When they had fallen asleep, Alec made his way quietly up the parapets. The airship lay in a dark lump on the glacier's futureless white. It looked smaller now, as if slowly deflating. No fires or lamps were visible, just the strange glow he'd noticed earlier. Tiny pinpricks of light moved in a wreckage like green fireflies buzzing around the giant creature's wounds. Alec shivered. He'd heard awful stories about the Darwinist creatures, half-breeds of tigers and wolves, mythological monsters brought to life, animals that spoke and even reasoned like humans but had no souls. He'd been told that when godless beasts were created, the spirits of demons occupied them, pure evil given flesh. Of course, he'd also been taught that the emperor was wise and kind, and that the Austrian people loved him, and that the Germans were his allies. Alec descended the tower stairs and crept past the sleeping men into the storerooms. The medicine kits were easy to find, 8 satchels marked with red crosses. He took 3, but didn't weigh himself down with any food. That could come later if the airship really was grounded for good. Changing into his commoner disguise, Alec ignored the furs, choosing the most ragged leather coat he could find. From the weapons room, he took a Steer automatic pistol and 2 8-round clips. Hardly the sort of weapon a Swiss villager would carry, but Volger was right about one thing. This was still a war, and these Darwinists were the enemy. Finally, he chose a pair of snow boots. Alec wasn't sure how the contraptions were supposed to help him walk, but Klopp had exulted upon seeing them. Something about his mountain campaigns back in the Balkan Wars. The iron bolt of the castle gate slid slightly aside, and the huge door swung open with an easy push. It was so simple to walk out, throwing his hands wand safely to the cold wind. Certainly it felt nobler than hiding here waiting to inherit an empire. Half a kilometer out onto the snow, Alec realized that he had finally snuck past his old fencing master. The snowshoes looked absurd, like tennis racks strapped to his boots. But they worked, keeping his feet from breaking through the brittle surface into the powder snow beneath. His long, sliding steps carried him quickly back along the stormwalker's footprints until he was far enough away that his tracks weren't visible from the castle walls. The smooth, almost featureless glacier was easy going, and in an hour he drew close enough to hear the Darwinist shouts as they worked on the wounded airship. He climbed up the valley side until he reached the ledge overlooking the vast shape.